Thank you. Sorry. To talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Oriental Orthodox Church, the relationship, the history, and kind of what's going on with our relationships with one another. So, the schism between the Eastern and the Oriental Church is probably one of the worst ones in history in terms of what happened. Because unfortunately, I wish that we had separated for good reason, but we didn't. There's never a good reason for a separation in the church, but this one was particularly, unfortunately, messy. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of where things are at right now. So to talk about the difference between us, or why we're separated, we have to understand the controversies that happened in the 4th century. And to understand the 4th century, you need to understand what was going on with the church. Because a lot of the times when we discuss these issues, we like to discuss them in isolation of the rest of history in the world, which you can't. So the early Christian church, as we know, started off in persecution. The people of Jerusalem were scattered because of it, right? They fled to Rome, they fled to other places. That's part of how actually the gospel spread. And the first few centuries were predominantly marked by distress, right? So we went through 10 major persecutions, and the last of which was the persecution of Emperor Diocletian, which is why the Coptic New Year, as we know, starts in September, was remembering his coronation, because we were proud of it. So Emperor Constantine in the year 313 put out something called the Edict of Tolerance, okay? And the Edict of Tolerance basically permitted Christians to be Christians legally. It wasn't proclaimed as the religion of the empire. It was simply now permitted to be a Christian. Whereas before that, it was illegal, right? That's why when you go to Rome or you go to places like that, one of the tourist sites is the catacombs, right? Is because the church had literally physically went underground to be able to survive and exist. So during this period of freedom, now the church wasn't obsessed with survival, right? Now the church was actually able to express herself and her theology and her beliefs. And so the focus no longer was on survival. It was on teaching, education, identity, right? And now we were enjoying a new liberality. So because of this, all sorts of new teachings started to come out. And so whereas we didn't have to define as much, there are definitions of faith that came before the 4th century, we didn't spend as much time in that as we did on other things. Now the faith was a big deal. And so when people came up with new ideas, the church had to be very quick to reply to these ideas, right? So one of the most famous, obviously, is Arius, who was teaching that there's a time when the sun was not, basically like an ancient Jehovah's Witness, or a Jehovah's Witness is a modern Arian. And so the church strongly stood up. And when it strongly stood up, it had its first, what we call, ecumenical council, right? So because it started off as a local issue that couldn't be contained, it reached a level where it had to be a whole church level meeting, right? And keep in mind, at this time, there are no denominations in the church. It's just the church, period. So the whole church got together to discuss the issue in the Council of Nicaea, and they reached a verdict. They also put out a document, which is now called the Nicene Creed, and it was a statement of faith up into the point of, yes, you believe in the Holy Spirit. That's where the Nicene Creed actually ended. And it was continued in the Council of Constantinople. So what was introduced here at the Council of Nicaea was a few things. One, this concept of big meeting, okay, like everybody getting together to make a decree. The other thing that arose out of it was something that I'm not particularly grateful to Emperor Constantine for, which was the introduction of primacy in the church. Okay, it was the idea or the concept of there being a hierarchy of the churches, not just within the church, but of the churches themselves. So what they said is that Rome, being where St. Peter and St. Paul were martyred, which is a big deal, and also being the capital of the empire, which was also at the time obviously a huge deal, is they gave Rome the title first among equals. Okay, and what first among equals meant was exactly that. We are all equal, okay, but here's a chair that we're going to defer to on jurisdictional matters that can't be resolved by the local church. So what does that mean? In modern English, it's almost like it's the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. Okay, is that if you have an issue in your local diocese, okay, in your patriarchate that you have not been able to resolve happily with your own bishop, then you have this Court of Appeals, which is Rome, that you can go to and say, hey, I feel wronged. My bishop put this verdict, and I'm not happy with it. Okay, so that was what it meant. So the churches had rankings. At the time of Nicaea, there was actually only 4 major churches. The 5th was just starting to kind of rise up. So those churches were the Church of Rome, Church of Antioch, which is modern-day Syria, okay, the Church of Jerusalem, the first church, and the Church of Alexandria, which is our church. Okay, the Church of Alexandria was growing like mad at the time. Okay, and so the Church of Alexandria was actually the first church where the title Pope was used. It was used before Rome, actually. And the reason why is because Papa Abba meant Father of Fathers, because the diocese was so big, okay, because most dioceses had just a bishop, that the bishop had to ordain bishops under him to help administer, because there was no way of doing the whole thing. So to differentiate him as their head, they called him the Papa Abba, which in modern English is Pope. And so we started having more of an administrative lean. We started to talk more about jurisdiction and organization than we did in previous times. After this whole issue of, is Jesus really God, right, which is what Arius's whole question mark was, or is he a man who became God in a way that we could, it raised new questions. So soon after everybody was in agreement that yes, we have always believed. They didn't decide Jesus was God on a vote, which is what they try and suggest in like the Da Vinci Code. It wasn't a vote on Jesus becoming God. Okay, it was a coming to an agreement on, is this what we have always proclaimed? Is this what the Lord even said? Yes or no? So there ended up being more controversies after, saying, okay, well, if he is God and he is man, how is he God and man at the same time? So around this time also is the emergence of Constantinople. Constantinople was the new emperor, the new capital of the empire, built by Emperor Constantine in his own name. And the Church of Constantinople was getting its own prestige because it was a new capital of the empire. It was the eastern capital, right? There's a western and an eastern capital. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople, actually, sorry, I skipped a piece before I get to there. Because there's 2 things that we need to look at. There's 2 schools of thoughts that were emerging in this time that are fundamentally important. Okay, is that there began to be a much stronger emphasis on Christian education. Okay, so the Church of Alexandria had the School of Alexandria, which is famous until this day, right? It's what produced a huge amount of theologians, right? And until this day, like, much credit is given to the School of Alexandria. They were really the forward thinkers. They were very philosophical. They were trained in rhetoric. They were trained in Greek philosophy. They were very, very bright people. And a bunch of our popes in a row were graduates of the School of Alexandria. And we had a certain way of talking in Alexandria and a certain way of teaching. In Antioch, there ended up being an emergence of their own school. Okay? And the Antiochians had their own way of speaking, right? We were all using Greek as our language, right? But we weren't using necessarily the same Greek. And by that I mean Americans speak English, Canadians speak English, the British speak English. They're not the same, right? And Australians. And we have expressions that mean different things, even though they're the same words in these different countries. So the language of theology was Greek, but the way that we express things were not all the same. So the Alexandrians had a certain way of speaking about Christology, and so did the Antiochians. So a bunch of things started to happen. The Patriarch of Constantinople, who was a graduate of the School of Antioch, invited or allowed a guest priest to preach in the cathedral. So this is not just any cathedral. This would be like the Vatican for the Catholics, okay, or Abdesseya for us, like in Egypt, okay. It was headquarters of the church. And in his sermon, he said, let anybody who calls the Virgin Mary the Mother of God be anathema, okay? Let him be accursed, basically damning anyone who calls her that to hell forever. And so the Patriarch didn't say anything, right? He praised the guy for his talk, and things went on for him as usual. News of this spread all over the empire because, like, what do you mean? Like, we call her that. So did you just anathematize all of us? Athanasius called her that. Other church fathers have called her that. So on what basis can you say that? So a big controversy emerged. Our patriarch, St. Cyril, wrote to Patriarch Nestorius, okay, of Constantinople, and said, hey, like, news has spread here that this happened. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. And all these letters still exist. You can read them. The originals are all around, and they're authentic, and they're acknowledged by all as authentic. So they start having a back and forth. Nestorius is like, no, I'm right, you're wrong. She's not Theotokos. And Nestorius had a way of speaking that made it sound like that Christ was sometimes God and sometimes man. Almost they had the kind of like on-off switch between when he's God and when he's man. So he'd be like, when he's doing miracles, at that point he's God. When he's eating, this time he's man. And so the response of the church was, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, then is this like a creature that had God go into him? Or is it a God-man? Or like, who died on the cross? Was it the man or was it the God? If it was God, how does God die? Okay, and if it was man, how are we saved? Right? So it created all sorts of conflict. So we ended up having another big meeting, which was the Third Council, which is the Council of Ephesus. And the reason I'm talking about this to get to the Easterners and us is because the real disaster, I think, started at the Council of Ephesus, not at the Council of Chalcedon. Because what happened in Ephesus is that the emperor was siding with Nestorius originally, and with the Patriarch of Antioch, whose name was John, because they felt like it was their school was under attack, that anything that they said was somehow not okay. Not to mention that John and Nestorius were good friends, like they went to school together. So there was two rival councils going on at the same time, what we now call the Council of Ephesus, okay, and another council. And there was a deadlock. And so it wasn't clear which council was going to be considered the binding one of the two. The emperor actually ordered Cyril to prison during this time. And Cyril was actually kind of sneaky. He was smuggling out letters in an empty cane with an old man. It was a very disturbing time for the church. Eventually, an anchorite, a solitary from Constantinople, who had a vow of silence or had a discipline of silence for decades or something like that. So he never would open his mouth, and everybody revered him as a saint. Led a procession from his anchorage to the emperor saying, Cyril is right. And there ended up being a movement. The emperor, who didn't even like Cyril, and he has some very aggressive writings against Cyril, ratified the Council of Ephesus, of which Cyril was presiding, and that was what prevailed. The problem was, there's this rival council that was now not accepted, right? That was led by John of Antioch. So we talked about these five major churches, the four that we said, and now the Church of Constantinople. Now, because of this, there was a division, right? Because the Church of Antioch didn't want to accept the Council of Ephesus. They weren't there, and they didn't like our language. And so we had a period, this council was in the year 431, where Cyril and John start writing back and forth. And eventually they reach an agreement, and it's now called the Letter of Reconciliation, where St. Cyril basically says to John of Antioch, listen, like, as long as our understanding of who Christ is the same, we have no reason to insist on each other saying it the same way. Okay, so I now know that when you are saying this, what you mean is this, right? And when we are saying this, this is what we mean. So there's no reason for us to be in division. And so John accepted that. And so finally, the churches were reunited again. And so that happened, but unfortunately, it wasn't done in the form of a council. It was done as a personal correspondence. So there were still people in Antioch who hated Cyril's guts. And they weren't quiet about it, and I'm not inventing it for them. When Cyril died in the year 444, one of them said, oh, poor devil is going to have to deal with him now. And he wrote like very extravagantly of how like it must suck for everybody in hell to have to put up with Saint Cyril being down there with them. So it was not even remotely like a Christian tone to it, but I'm saying it to make it clear that it was ugly. There's no denying that there was politics, and it was not anything that we should be proud of or be rejoicing over. So when he died in the year 444, Pope Dioscorus assumed the throne of Alexandria, and became the 25th patriarch. So during those times, right, there was still unrest about this whole Christology thing, and the Church of Constantinople was starting to rise. The Church of Egypt was actually assigned a patriarch to Constantinople after Nestorius was deposed. So I'm saying this to say there's starting to be a bit of a feeling of this dominance of Alexandria that was kind of rubbing people the wrong way, right? Where it's like, why are the Alexandrians putting in somebody, and why is it the school of Alexandria that's always leading at these councils? There's a sense of this that appears to be going on. A monk in Constantinople named Eutyches had a guest speaker come who was a bishop. And the bishop said something that Eutyches accused him of being heretical when it came to Christology. And the bishop took it really, really personally and wanted the patriarch of Constantinople to excommunicate the monk. And so the patriarch of Constantinople, whose name was Flavian, was like, listen, we've had a lot of problems, okay, in the last decade. We don't need more. Can we just let it go? Okay, I know you're not a heretic. He's not a heretic. Just let it go. The people are still dealing with the fact that they just lost their patriarch, right? Like, this would be literally the equivalent today of our synod finding Pope Tawadros guilty of heresy and deposing him. The church is going to be in chaos, right? They're not going to be ready to deal with a lot of things. So that's why the patriarch is saying, can you just let it go? But the bishop wouldn't. And so the bishop went and had a local council and condemns Eutyches for his way of Christology. So Eutyches, we're not really sure what he actually thought. The Easterners accuse him of saying that he was believing that God or Christ was God and man, okay, but that his divinity swallowed up his humanity, that he just became basically just God. And the reason why I say accuse is because he is not very clear on his theology, okay? And he said so. We denounce him today, so I'm not defending him as a saint, okay? However, he himself said, listen, I'm no theologian, right? All I'm saying is that Christ is one, right? I don't know how to say it, but that's what I mean. But he also had an ego. So when he was deposed, he had a friend in high places, which was the emperor. So he appealed to the emperor and said, my patriarch did this to me. So the emperor, because he was friends, said, well, then you know what? Let's have another council, okay? And let us discuss whether Eutyches, whether his Christology is right, or whether the person who excommunicated him, which is Flavian, the patriarch of Constantinople, is right. Because they're saying two different things, and they can't both be right. So he summoned the bishops and said, I want to have another council. And who did he request to preside over the council was Dioscorus of Alexandria. And this was a little bit of a slap in the face because the Court of Appeals is supposed to be the Church of Rome, right? So right off the bat, the Church of Rome was a little bit bothered that the emperor was going to Alexandria as the president of the synod instead of going to Leo, who was the pope at the time of Rome. And the emperor asked to co-preside with him Juvenal, the bishop of Jerusalem. Okay, so these are, again, we talk about the 5 major sees. And so they call a council to resume in Ephesus again. We call this Ephesus II. The Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, they call it the Robber Council. And they call it the Robber Council because they accuse Dioscorus of having a bunch of thugs come in and making people sign blank papers. And then they would write what they wanted to be the creed afterwards, which historically is inaccurate. Because we have the minutes of those meetings that have historically stayed, and because that very issue was discussed at the Council of Chalcedon, at which some of those bishops acknowledged that that was a lie. So I'm not just saying that because I'm a Copt, I'm saying it because it is a lie. At that council, Eutyches came and said, listen, whatever it is, all I know is one thing. Whatever it is that St. Cyril says, I believe. Okay? I believe that Christ is one. I believe this and this and this and this. And so they said, well, if he believes as Cyril does, then he's Orthodox. If he doesn't, then there's a problem. So if he's being excommunicated for being Orthodox, then the one who excommunicated him can't be Orthodox. We can't pretend that they're both right. And so when you lift an excommunication on someone, you effectively excommunicated someone else because you can't have both people be right. So the Patriarch of Constantinople was now excommunicated. And keep in mind that there are dozens and dozens of bishops. And I know this is talk we don't like to talk about, but this is why we're divided today. That's the reason why I'm going into it. So dozens of bishops are there, if not more than 100. I don't even remember how many were at Ephesus too. And they all signed. The guards of the emperor, the people who came to arrest Patriarch Flavian, really roughed him up. Really roughed him up. They beat him up so badly that he actually died of the wounds within a few days, which is obviously a tragedy. And by all accounts, even of the Oriental, Flavian was a great guy. Like he was known to be meek and very kind and very loving, and clearly he was trying to be a peacemaker. And so when somebody like that is killed, obviously the people are going to rally around him and feel that an injustice has happened, because an injustice did happen. He shouldn't have been killed like that. And so now a whole bunch of churches rose up to say, this is unacceptable. So Pope of Rome, Pope Leo, who's already upset about not being asked to preside, was upset about another thing. He had written a document, now called the Tome of Leo, in which he expressed what he believed to be the nature of Christ. And in this document, he used language that to an Oriental sounds very suspiciously Nestorian. He started saying, he goes, each nature does what is proper to it. The one does miracles and does blah, blah, blah. The other eats and cries and does all these things. And so to an Alexandrian graduate, it was like, here we go again, right? Here you are talking about this divided person where a piece of him is doing this and another piece of him is doing this. This isn't right. And so his tome wasn't read at the local council of Ephesus because he didn't attend the council. It was called to be read a couple of times, and it didn't end up being read, and that's its own story for discussion. So as a consequence, Leo wasn't very happy. The emperor of the time, Theodosius, had some plans up his sleeve that even Rome wasn't aware of. The emperor wanted to change the capital of the empire to Constantinople. He wanted there to be only one capital, and he wanted it to be Constantinople. And consequently, he wanted the new Rome, not just to be geographically the new Rome, but ecclesiastically and on the church level to become the new Rome. He wanted Constantinople to now be called the first among equals. And he wanted to do it in the style of Emperor Constantine, because that's the one who first had done all of this. And so he wanted the council, which is now called the Council of Chalcedon, he wanted it to be in Nicaea. And he wanted it to be in Nicaea because he wanted a new creed. Basically, he wanted to be seen as this great reformer who did all of these things. So he gave Leo the impression that his tome was going to be used as the new creed, even though he actually had different plans. So he summons the council, and they say, if Dioscorus, even though he wasn't the only one who was at the council, deposed Flavian, we need to try Dioscorus for his faith. So they summoned a council, which is now called the Council of Chalcedon, and they all went to meet there. Dioscorus, once he went, was not even treated as a bishop. He was told, you're not allowed to sit with the bishops, you sit with the normal people. You're on trial. Dioscorus complied, although he asked, is there any reason why all of my co-presiders aren't on trial with me? It's not like I did a council by myself, right? Juvenal of Jerusalem co-presided with me. Why is he not, for example, on trial with me? So they actually weren't able to do much with him in terms of faith because he hadn't said anything wrong. And so at one point when they said into natures, when they were dialoguing, Dioscorus interrupted and said, forgive me, not into natures, but of two natures. Forgive my, and these are exact words, forgive my impudence on this matter, for it is a matter which touches my soul. And he said that because Cyril never spoke of Christ in two natures. Because to us, when someone says in two natures, it sounds to us like the person is saying that here's a person, okay, who then gets subdivided into these two things, okay, which we're going to talk about later isn't what they mean, okay, but that's how we were understanding their language. Whereas what we prefer to say is that Christ is one person who is of two natures. So in other words, if you can see human and divine here, two arrows pointing up, and this makes Christ, right? We're seeing them as having arrows pointing down, and we're doing arrows pointing up, right? And so he said that, and nobody responded, okay? They started talking about things. They weren't able to really hold on anything. The full minutes of the Council of Chalcedon are available, and these are minutes that are not like a Coptic Orthodox production. These are the ecumenical minutes that are observed and acknowledged as true by all of the churches. Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, everybody acknowledges these as the minutes. So there's nothing that I'm afraid of here for fact-checking, because the history speaks for itself very clearly. No theological issue was found in Dioscorus or even really discussed by him, because there wasn't much to discuss at that point. So during the council, they wanted, again, to kind of silence, there's this alliance now between Constantinople, Rome, and Antioch. Jerusalem started to get worried, okay, because they were like, this isn't looking good for us. The Bishop of Jerusalem, Juvenal, actually told his people, if I come back from the Council of Chalcedon, having signed the Tome of Leo, don't accept me back. Within no time, Juvenal was sitting on the other side of the table with Rome, Constantinople, and Antioch. Then they had a secret session of the council, and I'm calling it a secret session because it was a secret session, where they did not have the whole council try Dioscorus. They had a small group, and the rest of the council didn't know it was happening. And they summoned Dioscorus to come to the council, to this secret session. Dioscorus, the first summons, said, not feeling well. The second one, and I'm not going to say he wasn't feeling well. He probably wasn't, but I'm sure that wasn't the real reason why he wasn't going. When they summoned him the second time, he said, listen, if you're going to try me, but bring Juvenal with me, because he co-presided. The third summons, he said, listen, you already decided you're going to do what you're going to do. Just do it, because it makes no difference whether I'm there or not, if you've already decided what you're going to do. Because of this, they excommunicated him. And because the church had a system, like a court, we have thrice summons. If you ignore the thrice summons, you're deposed, you're held in contempt. So Dioscorus was now deposed for contempt. Okay, and if you look at the official excommunication of the Council of Chalcedon against Dioscorus, there's not a mention of his theology. It is only written that it is because of his failure to appear at the council after the thrice summons that he is held in contempt and stripped of his priesthood. The next day, they come back to the regular session, and the rest of the council is shocked to find out, there's hundreds of bishops at Chalcedon, is shocked to find out that Dioscorus was deposed, including his own bishops. His own bishops that came with him had no clue. And they suddenly found out that they don't have a pope, according to this council. And so the council said, well, are you going to join us? And they said, absolutely not. And they said, we don't agree, and our people will kill us. And so they got up and went back to Egypt. Macarius, the bishop whose feast we actually celebrated last Saturday, he's the third of the three Macarii that we talked about, the three Macarius, wanted to go and exile Pope Dioscorus to Gangra in Turkey. And Pope Dioscorus actually told him, no, actually, you have a crown of martyrdom waiting for you in Alexandria. Go home. Go home and help the people until you're murdered too. They ripped out his beard. They physically abused him. And they after beating him up, they sent him into exile. They then tried to put their own patriarch over us in Egypt, which Alexandria completely rejected. And so from that point on, we were in schism. Then we went through a lot of difficult times. Okay, we were actually persecuted, and I don't just mean like psychologically. And I also want to say I'm a great admirer of the Eastern Orthodox Church, so this is going to flip at one point, but like there's just an ugly point of history. But there's factually no denying that we were persecuted by them. We were murdered. They did send soldiers, and anyone who didn't sign the Tome of Leo or who didn't prescribe to the Chalcedonian definition of faith was exiled or killed or suffered or all sorts of stuff. That's why St. Samuel the Confessor, for example, we call him a confessor because for refusing to sign the tome, they put out his eye. But at that council, a couple of things happened that are very important. One is that Leo kind of got tricked because the emperor suddenly said, I want a new creed. And this was not expected by the bishops. And to their credit, the bishops were not comfortable with that. Like, they were not, oh, that's so cool, let's do it, we'll be famous. They were instead like, why? Why do we need a new definition of faith? And so if you read what they wrote, it was very, and not ambiguous, it was very, like, choppy. They're trying to figure out what we're not saying, what we are saying, like, they're trying to string it together. But one very important canon came out of Chalcedon that played a huge role in the future, which was they gave Constantinople equal status to Rome. And this ended up being a very big deal. because the 200 years that followed, there was a lot of arguing, there's a lot of back and forth, and there were times where we almost came to full unity again. And we had a couple of emperors actually that were sympathetic to the so-called Monophysites, which is what the Easterners call us. We're not Monophysite, but those who believe in one nature, okay? One of them in particular is Emperor Zeno, whose daughter is Saint Hilaria. And he had a document called the Henoticon, the Article of Unity. And what he did is say, okay, guys, can we just agree that we believe the same things? Okay, so like those of us who say into nature is what we mean is this, those of us who say one nature, what we really mean is this, and all of us excommunicate anybody who disagrees with this. So our Pope actually signed it. Pope Peter Mongus signed it. St. Severus of Antioch refused. And this is actually a really funny point in history because Severus was the patriarch of Antioch. And Antioch hated Alexandria. But Severus was the first patriarch of Antioch who said, no, Alexandria was right. And so he actually switched sides. So Antioch was against us and he switched sides and said, no, that council has to be altogether denied because we cannot proclaim something to be right that wasn't. Because also at that council, they exonerated people who they had excommunicated at Ephesus too for teaching heresy. Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret of Cyrus, there's a few big names that were there. So if you read Meyendorff, I believe it was Meyendorff, who's an Eastern Orthodox theologian, he actually says it very clearly. He basically says that the real theology during that period was coming out of the Oriental churches, whereas the Eastern Orthodox at that time was reduced to apologetics. Where they were just trying to defend as much as they could what Alexandria was saying. Like, well, you have a problem with this, and a problem with this, and a problem with this. In the end, there was no agreement, okay? It just, everyone's egos got in the way, and particularly one thing got in the way. Constantinople outright said at one point, we are ready to say that you are Orthodox. We know that you are. But we are not ready to let go of the canon of Chalcedon that makes us equal to Rome. And so we're not going to sign any document that makes us lose that. Right? And Rome didn't want them to have that. Right? That's what I'm saying. This is the ugliest time in history because this is all politics. Right? Like, it's dressed up with Christology. Okay? But the truth of the matter is, this was the ugliness of humanity. There's no denying it. Where it's like, if I get this, you get this, I'll write this. It was an absolute mess. So each basically went to his own. We were saved in Egypt, quote unquote, from the Byzantines by the Muslims. The persecution against us actually ended when the Muslims entered Egypt, because we weren't being ruled by the Byzantines anymore. We went through our own persecutions with them eventually, actually for a really long time, but it was no longer by the Christians. And so we ended up basically going into seclusion, right, of being cut off from the rest of the world from the minute that the Muslims entered Egypt. And then the Eastern Church that recognized the Council of Chalcedon appointed their own patriarch in Alexandria, which never really flourished very much, right? And that's why there's still to this day a Greek Orthodox patriarch of Alexandria. His name is also Tewodros. It's Theodorus, and he's a very good man. So we ended up growing in isolation from each other. Unfortunately, the Easterners and the Catholics have their fifth council, and I say unfortunately because in the fifth council, they clarify, quote unquote, their Christology. And the clarification of their Christology is something that we would be perfectly happy with, because how they expressed it identifies exactly what the Alexandrians were saying the whole time. And so I say unfortunately because we weren't invited, because we were seen as being schismatic. And had we been there, I think we would have easily been able to sign, because they were saying exactly what we're saying. But a problem arose that we often suggest that they need to deal with on their end, because at that council, they then condemned the same people that they exonerated at their fourth council, which we point out as being a glaring problem. Because if you were calling that person not a heretic at the fourth council, which is what we were saying they were, and at the fifth you're saying, actually, yes, they are, you need to revisit the whole thing, which is one of our main points of contention we talk about councils. So we grew up in isolation from one another for a very long time. In the 60s, we finally started talking again as the world started to open up. Pope Kyrillos VI actually was one of the first ones to have us in a dialogue with the Eastern Orthodox churches, and the Roman Catholics, I believe, were there at the same time. I'm not sure. Where we said, well, let's talk. All right, let's find out what each of us are saying. These talks went exceptionally well, like exceptionally well. There was hardliners on both sides; they existed, but those who had the dialogue were finding that we were saying the same thing, right? And that when an Easterner says that Christ is in two natures, they're not saying he's dumped into two natures. They're saying that Christ is in all. Like they have a different way that just it's foreign to us. Like to us, it's just weird, right? Whereas when we were saying one nature, okay, to them, nature means thing, okay, or say it, right? So when we're saying there's only one thing, they're saying, okay, well then which is it, divinity or humanity? Whereas we were using the word nature to mean person in their language. So we're saying there's one person. They think we're saying one thing, right? We think they're saying two things in their language, or in our language, we thought they were saying two persons, right? And so we're like, you're a heretic, and like you're a heretic, and all we did was mudsling at each other. So when we actually started talking, we started realizing that no, we're not saying different things. We are very much saying the same things. And so we started having more and more dialogues. We had a few in Chambézy in Switzerland, where we ended up signing documents saying as much. So the official stance of the Coptic Orthodox Church today is that the Eastern Orthodox Church is Orthodox in her Christology. We don't have a stance against them because we have signed those documents as a synod. So if the synod has signed those documents saying that their Christology is Orthodox, then we are agreeing that they are Orthodox. Okay, so they are Orthodox. We have different formulas. We still need to lift the anathemas. And what Pope Shenouda said, and I think there was a great wisdom to this, was I'm ready to sign these documents, but the lifting of the anathemas on each side, okay, because we condemned Leo, they condemned Dioscorus, we have all these like bilateral condemnations. He's like, the lifting of these condemnations, it has to be done all together. Okay, it's not going to be like one person like, ha ha ha, I didn't, and so see, it turns out you were wrong, and all this, and restart the politics. He was like, we should have a joint liturgy at which we pray together for the first time, all of us, all of the patriarchs, right, and we lift the anathemas all together, to which they agreed. Unfortunately, on the Eastern side, all of the Oriental, if I'm not mistaken, yes, all of the Oriental are in agreement with this document. On the Eastern side, not all. There are certain groups, the Athonite monks, for example, there's a group of them that are very much against it, who are adamant that we are Monophysite, no matter what we tell them. And there are some hardliners in individual churches that have these issues. But we're hoping, like maybe in our time, that we could see something come from it. But because of it, we are not yet in full communion. However, there's been many things that we're doing to try and restore that unity, and it's going to come from the ground up. It's going to come only from humility. One of the agreements that we have with the Eastern Orthodox Church, for example, that Ambassadorian told our clergy, is that outside of Egypt, anyone who wants to marry somebody from the Eastern or Oriental, so long as both bishops from each side are in agreement, the two can marry without any restriction, which means that they can have full communion and full sacraments in both churches back and forth. It used to be like, oh, you'd have to choose one, right? Are you going to be Oriental? Are you going to be Eastern? Where now it's like, nope, you can go back and forth at will. There's no problem. The only caveat was that if God forbid you get a divorce, that you get a divorce from the church that married you. Like they'll deal with it because they took responsibility for crowning you. And that was it, which is a very nice gesture. And as for us on our side, Ambassador is like, and I'm in agreement. So I'm not going to be the obstacle to something like this happening. So we are trying. What we need to do is actually, there needs to be more understanding of one another. Because the way that I see what's happened, the analogy that I like to use is we're a bunch of brothers that got in a big stupid fight. Okay, we are having a dinner together at the table. We got in a huge fight, and the fight was allegedly about our dad, right? And so some people say no, it's politics. Some people are like, no, it really was about my dad. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Okay, and then in our tantrums, everybody left the house, right? And everybody left the house claiming that we kicked the other person out, right? Because everybody claims to be the Orthodox Church, right? And so then we grew in isolation, and then everybody told their kids all these stories about their uncles, right, of how dumb they were and how evil they were and what they did and what they said and how they did all these things. And then our kids repeat all the same things to each other, right? And they're like, ha ha, see, they did this. And all sorts of folklore like came out of it. The Easterners have a story of how at the Council of Chalcedon, the church that the council was held in was the Church of St. Euphemia the Martyr. And so they say, oh, we put the tome of Leo in her right hand and the tome of Dioscorus in her left hand, and we prayed, and in the morning when we came, we found the tome of Dioscorus under her feet. And I'm like, well, he didn't write one. Like, that never happened, right? And the story isn't even talked about at the council, nor by any of the contemporaries, nor is it mentioned until, like, I don't know how many hundred years later, right? So it's a made-up story. On our end, we're like, no. Dioscorus was held under house arrest and was prevented from going, and then they condemned him for not showing up. That's not true either, right? No, he refused to go. He very willingly refused to go, right? So we made up all these stories, and we tell people stuff about them, and we call each other names, right? What started to happen is that all of us immigrated to the same countries, right? And so we had to interact with each other. So we were all polite to each other to their faces, and then we go home, like, I met a guy from the other, like one of my cousins, like, oh, don't talk to him, he's bad. And then they come home like, oh, they said I'm bad. And they're like, oh, no, he's bad. And then we just keep on like fighting, right? And instead of saying, and then we have all these suspicions of each other, right? So the Eastern Orthodox have developed things, all of us develop things, because we're in isolation from each other. So there are things that each of us have that are going to seem so foreign to one another, right? So the Easterners talk about things in a different way than we do. So when they talk about, for example, the energies of God, right? That's not the way that most Alexandrians talk. We talk about grace. We usually mean the same thing, okay? But we don't always call it that. So then you'll have an Oriental who's like, what is this energies business? No, that's not real. That's not Orthodox, right? And then you have someone on their side being like, aha, he thinks this isn't right. Then he must be heterodox. Because if he was, he would say this like I say it, right? Then we find that they're doing some weird practice like pre-sanctified gifts, or which we had at one point too, or marriage of an Orthodox and a heterodox in the church. I'm like, aha, you're heterodox because how could you do blah, blah, blah. Instead of us saying, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Where did it come from? What does it mean? What do you mean when you say this? Right? Like, then we can actually start understanding each other and what everybody is saying. So on our end, for example, we didn't use the word theosis much in our church. We were using sanctification as a word. We were using all sorts of words, but we very much believe in theosis, right? But the word theosis in Arabic sounds like you're saying that I'm going to become God by nature, which is a heresy, right? So we have someone like Pope Shenouda who wrote against theosis and called it a heresy, right? So then you have all these Easterners who read that and like, aha, wow, they call theosis heresy. They're totally messed up. So then they go running back to the church and saying, oh, the Copts are actually really not Orthodox. They don't believe in theosis, right? Without trying to understand where are we coming from and what are we saying. Do we believe in it? Yes, we do. Do we always call it that? No, we don't. And you need to understand our Islamic context, right? When you're surrounded by a bunch of Muslims who already don't like us calling Jesus God, okay? And then you're saying everyone gets to be God, right? Then they're not going to take that well, and they start persecuting us more, right? So from a pastoral perspective, our Pope needs to care very much about what terminology that we use, which somebody who's growing up freely in the West isn't going to appreciate because they're not under the same influences. So we all have to start kind of interacting more, and we need to start differentiating a problem within each family, because every family will have developed problems, right? What family doesn't have fights, right? What family doesn't have a teenager who did something wrong? What family doesn't have like somebody who got a gambling issue, or somebody that had an alcohol issue, or a cousin who like did something really messed up? We all have it, right? So if we start trying to pretend we have no problems, we'll be liars. And if we start trying to condemn a family because they have problems, then we're also being irrational, right? Which is the stuff that's starting to happen. So I'm hoping that our increased dialogue with one another will be good. Our Metropolitan is actually used to be one of the ecumenical representatives of the Coptic Orthodox Church. He's close friends with the ecumenical patriarch and with all of the local Eastern Orthodox hierarchs. They love him and respect him very much. And it's mutual. He speaks very highly, actually, of them as well. So it's important for us to understand the history, to know why we're at where we're at. It would be wrong for us to be mudslinging at the Easterners. I don't care if an Easterner calls me Orthodox or not. Okay, I know that I'm Orthodox. So I'm not worried about someone's label of me. But it's important for us to know and appreciate our heritage and our history. But it is also more important that we actually genuinely, truly desire and strive for unity. Because Christ's dying prayer was for our unity. So it should never be acceptable to us to be happy that there's a division, right? We should never gloat that we're different. We should not even have an attitude of like, ha ha ha, when they're ready to become Orthodox, they can come talk to us. That's wrong, right? It should be, we want to be one, we're willing to be one, we'll do what it takes to be one. The only thing that will never be at the expense of is truth, right? We will never lie for unity, okay? But we will be ready to sacrifice whatever it takes for unity, because that is what God's will is for the church, that we be one even as he is one. Sorry that was so long and political and technical. Any questions or comments or concerns about that or about the general issues between us and the Easterners? Okie dokie. I guess not.
Are they still having conversation to try to get to communion, not just the marriage thing?
There are and there aren't. Like, it depends on who you talk to, right? So you have some people who are very zealous for it from both sides. Some of the official dialogues, especially the theosis issue, really kind of slowed things down because of these accusations that we don't believe in it. So I think there's a real desire on most of the Eastern Orthodox patriarchs' side. The ecumenical patriarch is in a bit of a fix because the minute he were to proclaim like acceptance, which he'd be more binding, he's kind of like, because of that canon that we were talking about, he's basically like the Pope of the Easterners. There will be division in his church right away, right? Like the Athonite monks, for example, that don't like us, a bunch of them don't recognize him, like, and he's their own patriarch. Like, they won't say his own name in liturgy. So it's a really difficult situation. So there is still dialogue. Emma Krulus from our diocese actually is the official face for the Russian dialogue. So that dialogue is still happening, thank God. But these documents basically have been ready for 50 years and nobody's taken a pen to sign. That's the issue. Like, everything is ready. Like, there's nothing that is not in order and ready. It might be worth asking Emma Krulus to come and talk about the status of it. Would be good.
Where is the Greek Orthodox Church?
They're in the Eastern Church, so they were the Church of Constantinople, and then Constantinople and Greece like separated. And there's a lot of hardliners in the Greek Church. Having said that, I have a personal story of that. I didn't know we were divided when I was a kid. And when I was in first year college, I got on those old, I don't know if you remember those Usenet groups before forums existed. And I went on to alt.religion.eastern Orthodox, and I wrote, are there any other Coptic Orthodox Christians out here? And the response was, this question presupposes you may even call yourself Orthodox because there are a body of us who believe are Monophysite and thus heretic. And I was like, whoa. And then I looked up Monophysite, I'm like, what is that, an insect? And then like found out what they were saying, and I thought it was hilarious. Because I'm like, oh, that's what you think? That's so simple. No, we don't. I'm like, because in our confession, we say, like, his divinity and his humanity without mingling, without confusion, without twinkling of an eye. Done. Right? I wouldn't say that if I don't believe it. And so I started reading more and more and more and more, everything that I could get my hands on from both sides, because I'm like, wait, what if they're right? What if we are heretics? What if blah, 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 blah? And I had a particular loathing, and I'll confess it, of the Greeks, because the Athonites are Greeks, right? And so they have this staunch, very anti-Coptic, specifically anti-Coptic, not just all the Oriental, but specifically us in that church. When I moved up north in Canada, I was praying liturgy in my room. There's no Coptic Orthodox church. There's no Oriental Orthodox church. So I would pray liturgy in my room, and I would do all this stuff. One Sunday morning, I went for a drive, and I, by accident, found a Greek Orthodox church. And I didn't see any cars parked, so I went in the parking lot to go in, and I didn't know the cars were parked on the other side. So I went in, and they were like in communion, and I'm like, great. I'm going to get owned for being a Monophysite. Which, by the way, we are Miaphysite, just so you know what the actual term is. So I was like, okay, here's my strategy. I'm going to close my eyes and pretend I'm praying when they're all going up to get their Urbon. And that way, no one will yell at me. They're going to leave the praying guy alone. So I go with my eyes closed strategy, and suddenly someone's tapping me. I look up, and it's the priest, and I'm like, great. He's like, "Hi, I'm Father Nicholas," and he was like, "Who are you?" I'm like, "I'm just gonna let it all out. If I'm gonna get spat on, let it just happen." So like, my name is so and so, and I'm Coptic Orthodox. And I was waiting for like a O, or like E, or like that's nice, like you can go. Instead, he was like, "Oh, wonderful." He was like, "Well," he's like, "Welcome." It was January 6th. He goes, "I know tomorrow's Christmas for you." He was like, "So Merry Christmas," because they're a new calendar. And he was like, "I don't know if you know, but we have a joint agreement where you guys don't have a church, you can have communion, and vice versa." He goes, when I was over in the West, he was actually the Ethiopians took care of me." And I'm like, "What?" And he was like, "So if you're okay with it and your spiritual father's okay with it, I don't have a problem giving you communion." And I'm like, this Muslim. I'm like, is this for real? And so I stayed with him for the whole period that I was on my rotations. And before I left, I sent him an email, and I was like, "Father Nick, I want to say, like, you won me over with your humility and your love." And I was like, because of all the Eastern churches, I hated yours the most. And I was like, but now I can't say that. I was like, I can't say that because you're the one who took care of me in my time of need. And I was like, it was the Samaritan who took me in. And I'm like, and it's now changes how I speak about your whole church because you did the opposite of what I expected. So he was like, no, we need to talk. So we went out, we had a good conversation. Today, like years later when I became a priest, we're close friends. When I was blogging about these issues a few weeks ago, and he called me up. He's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And so like when he came here on a visit, we vested together to pray for a sick person together. And he was crying. He was crying for joy that like an Oriental and Easterner were wearing a sadra together, a stole together, and praying. Right? And that's what I'm saying. All of this love and unity can come when we have humility, right? Is to not bend. On the other side now, when one of them will come and ream me out, I don't respond the way that I used to. I went to one church and the guy's like, I'm an officer. And I'm like, no, I'm not. And I laughed. Like I wasn't like, no, you are an historian. And I even told him, I was like, dude, well, I didn't call him dude, but I was like, Father, I'm like, I could call you an historian. I could. And I was like, but it would be wrong. Like it would be wrong to keep propagating something that's not true. I know that you're Orthodox. I don't care whether you reciprocate. I know that you're Orthodox. And I was like, we are. You don't have to accept it. And I was like, but the truth is, I know that you're not. And I could call you an historian when you guys say this. It sounded like this to us. What we're saying is this, but whatever. And so the guy calmed down. The next time that I went, originally didn't want to greet me. The next time I went, he jumped up, gave me a hug, brought in his youth, right? The attitude has to be humility. It has to be love. It has to be a real desire for oneness from the heart. It can't be a superficial thing. Awesome.
What's the Metropolitan view of using some of Antiochian and
I don't know if he's ready for that. You can ask him. He might be. I don't want to speak on his behalf. And when I say ready, I don't think it would be. I'm speaking very unfiltered right now. I don't think it's because he's worried about his orthodoxy. I think it's more along the lines of there's a real trend, and I'm speaking now for me, not for him, but I know that he's aware of it, where a lot of cops are self-haters. Okay, and so because we don't have as much English stuff and as poetic or prose or the same volume as them, a lot of people when they start to use the Eastern stuff have this reaction of like, oh wow, they must be more Orthodox because they have this and this and this when they've just been around for a lot longer. And so I sometimes have a worry that when we're overly using all this stuff and not actually translating our own, of which we have in abundance, we just haven't been translating, right? Then we start to lose our identity because as much as they are Orthodox, they do have a different tradition, right? And we have a tradition, right? So we need to rediscover, I think, our tradition first. So I think Amasarabian, I don't know what his stance is, will be trying to balance between the two, right? Between keeping our own tradition while acknowledging that there's nothing wrong with importing things that could be useful to us in the service. But when he visits, I would ask him. He's never shy to address those issues, even publicly. Sweet. All right. What do you guys do now? Is it Urban or like? Okay, sorry.
We stared at all.